he published an 11-point manifesto stressing that total prohibition, reduction of the land revenue, and the military expenditure, and the abolition of the salt tax were the vital needs of the people. Next to air and water, salt is perhaps the greatest necessity of life, wrote Gandhi. In a letter to the Viceroy, he announced his intention: if my letter makes no appeal to your heart, on the 11th day of this month, I shall proceed to disregard the provisions of the salt law. As the independence movement is essentially for the poorest in the land, the beginning will be made with this evil. On receiving a no from the Viceroy, Gandhi exclaimed, "On bended knees I asked for bread, and I received stone instead." Gandhi resolved that he would himself perform the first act of civil disobedience by taking salt illegally from the sea with select ashram inmates for whom non-violence was an article of faith. India was preparing to vindicate its right to freedom. On March 9, 1930, crowds and crowds of men, women, and children forded the river Sabarmati. 75,000 people met and in Gandhi's presence took the pledge: without achieving freedom for our country, we shall not rest in peace, nor will the government get peace. Gandhi devoted all his time and energy to an intensive preparation of the ashram for the final conflict at the appointed hour. Everyone was on the tiptoe of expectation. On the eve of the historic Salt March, Gandhi touched the tender chords of the people's hearts when he said, "These may be the last words of my life on the sacred banks of the Sabarmati. We have resolved to utilize all our resources in the pursuit of an exclusively non-violent struggle. Women can stand shoulder to shoulder with men in this movement." Hoping that the stream of civil resistors would flow unbroken, he gave instruction: after I have broken the law wherever possible, civil disobedience of salt laws should be started by manufacturing, purchasing, and selling contraband salt. May God keep off all obstacles from the path in the struggle that begins tomorrow. On March 12th, with the coming of daylight, India's soul was awake. More and more eager and throbbing crowds collected. Prayers having been sung, the pilgrim was ready to make the great beginning of the great movement. The long-awaited hour arrived, and he was there. The great march for liberty began. Gandhi started on his 241-mile-long trek from the ashram to Dandi, a village on the sea coast, along with his chosen band of 78 ashram inmates, symbols of the national determination with a strong resolve and undaunted look. As the epic march began, multitudes thundered out their welcome to the revolution and expressed their will to do and die through the cries of Inqilab Zindabad. 61-year-old Gandhi, with his undying faith in the justice of the cause he was pursuing and in the success of the great campaign he had embarked upon, marched at the head of the procession with quick and unfaltering steps. The pilgrim marches onward on his long trek through the seas of humanity to the appointed place where India is first coming to grips with the great British Empire, observed Jawaharlal Nehru. staff in hand, he goes along the dusty roads of Gujarat, clear-eyed and firm of step, with his faithful band trudging along behind him. Many a journey he has undertaken in the past, many a weary road traversed, but longer than any that have gone before is this last journey of his, and many are the obstacles in his way. But the fire of great resolve is in him, and surpassing love of his countrymen. None that passes him can escape the spell, and men of common clay feel the spark of life. It is a long journey, for the goal is the independence of India and the ending of the exploitation of her millions. The soldiers of freedom marched all along the distance of 13 miles to Aslali, the first halt. The villagers gave a ceremonial reception to the Satyagrahis on the outskirts of the village. After the day's march through heat and dust, Gandhi and his followers entered the village Dharamshala for the night's rest. In the evening, the prayer meeting was held in the village. Gandhi explained his mission. The soldiers of the first batch had burnt their boats the moment the march began. He added that he would not return to the ashram until the Salt Act was repealed and Swaraj won. He expounded the real nature of democracy. We want to establish a government which will not do anything against the will of the people. He exhorted the villagers to take to the spinning wheel, to look to the sanitation of the village, and to treat the untouchables with brotherly love. He also urged them to join the movement to break the most inhuman poll tax, as it would be a step forward on the way to Swaraj. Next morning, the people of Aslali saw Gandhi stride away with his pilgrim band to the next stage in the journey to the sea. Daily, Gandhi tramped about 10 miles. On the way, he spoke on his familiar themes, beseeching the people to abjure alcohol, abandon child marriage, and, when the signal came, to break the salt law. As the procession marched through village after village, the people followed the fortunes of this marching column from day to day, and the temperature of the country went up. The army was marching in a disciplined manner. The agile general in front was indeed a source of inspiration to all. The march continued, and the message of sedition came in clearer and firmer tones. In 10 days, the marchers covered 115 miles, half the distance between Sabarmati and Dandi. The pitch of the people's emotion was rising, and so was the readiness for sacrifice. On the 15th day, the band reached Broch and crossed the river Narmada. April came. Gandhi drew near to the sea, and the country waited for the word to begin civil disobedience. Gandhi conducted his daily prayer meetings and spoke at all the halting places. Seeking the people's cooperation for the righteous struggle, he observed, Satyagraha cannot succeed without a spirit of purity and self-sacrifice. The rebel preached the duty of disloyalty. Loyalty to a state so corrupt is a sin, disloyalty a virtue. In the area traversed, several village headmen threw up their government jobs. Gandhi admonished his hosts for being lavish and extravagant in welcoming the marchers. In your hospitality towards servants like us, you will have to be miserly rather than lavish. He was confident of enlisting the cooperation of the people. It was his feeling that women would contribute more to the struggle for Swaraj than men. Gandhi voiced his firm determination to win Swaraj. Either I shall return with what I want, or my dead body will float in the ocean. Monday was a day of rest every week. Gandhi insisted on the ashram routine being followed by every one of the pilgrims, especially in 3 essentials: prayer, spinning, and writing the daily diary. That rigorous self-discipline will generate in us, said he, a force which will enable us to retain what we have won. Truth was once again on the march. Never was the wave of patriotism so powerful in the hearts of Indians as it was on this great occasion. The eyes of the world were focused on Gandhi and on Dandi, a small village on the seashore in Gujarat, which was preparing to receive streams of men and women. Dandi, the destination of the great march, was in sight. After a 241-mile-long trek, lasting for 24 days, the pilgrims reached the promised land on the morning of April 5th. Sarojini Naidu received Gandhi and his followers on the outskirts of the village. On reaching Dandi, Gandhi felt greatly relieved. God be thanked for what may be termed the happy ending of the first stage in this, for me at least, the final struggle for freedom. Gandhi arrived at his seaside resort for rest. After relaxing for a few hours, he set out to prepare the people for the war against the salt tax that was to begin next morning. Addressing the eager crowds gathered under the banyan tree, Gandhi reaffirmed his decision to break the salt law. God willing, I expect with my companions to commence actual civil disobedience tomorrow morning. 6th April has been to us, since its culmination in the Jallianwala massacre, a day for penance and purification. I am positive that the greater the purification, the speedier will be the glorious end for which the millions of Indians, consciously or unconsciously, are striving. He issued a warning. Those who fear the government will leave. Only those who are prepared for jail going and for receiving bullets should accompany me tomorrow morning. May God always be with us. On April 6th, the first day of the National Week, Gandhi's morning prayer was more than usually solemn. He gave final instructions for the struggle and nominated Abbas Tayyabji and after him Sarojini Naidu as his successors. Soon after, Gandhi with his satyagrahis proceeded for a bath in the sea before launching the struggle amidst deafening cries of Mahatma Gandhi ki jai. The leaders and his followers bathed in the sea. After the dip into the sea, walking at a slow pace in solemnity, Gandhi picked up a lump of natural salt on the seashore, and the nefarious monopoly was broken. This was the signal for which the nation had been long waiting. The act performed, India had its cue. It seemed as though a spring had been suddenly released all over the country. The agitation and disobedience spread to the far-flung regions. India was seething in revolt. It was open to anyone who would take the risk of prosecution under the salt law to manufacture salt wherever he wished and wherever it was convenient. The main thing was to commit a breach of the obnoxious law. The program impressed the multitude and made them act in an organized way. In town and villages, everywhere within reach of the sea, salt manufacture was the action of the day. Due to the abounding enthusiasm of the people, this program spread like a prairie fire. Most striking was the part of women in the national struggle. In the hour of trial, they came out in large numbers from the seclusion of their homes and threw themselves into the struggle. Gandhi observed, in this non-violent warfare, women's contribution should be much greater than men's. To call women the weaker sex is a libel. It is man's injustice to women. If non-violence is the law of our being, the future is with woman. Many curious expedients were adopted to produce salt. It was waved about in triumph and often auctioned for fancy prices. Nowhere had a law been more peacefully and yet more defiantly disobeyed. All honor to the people who were fighting this unequal battle with bravery and a firm determination to go through the brutalities and tortures perpetrated on them. There were numerous prosecutions, more numerous arrests, far more numerous detentions, forcible seizures of salt, and brutal and savage assaults on the people. And yet, there was unbreakable peace everywhere, and greater determination to prosecute the campaign. The war against the salt tax continued. On the 13th of April ended the most glorious of all the national weeks since 1919. Leaders were being removed from the midst of the people. On the arrest of Jawaharlal Nehru, the Congress president, Gandhi observed, "It is an affront offered to the whole nation." The arch-offender was kept free, and his activities continued unabated. Day after day, he went to the surrounding villages and delivered the message of disobedience. This Indian empire was conceived in immorality. Let us therefore pray and work for the destruction of this demonstrably immoral system with the national creed of non-violence. Sisters should picket liquor shops, opium dens, and foreign cloth shops. For who can make a more effective appeal to the heart than women? Foreign cloth undermines the economic foundations of the nation and throws millions out of employment. So, young and old in every home should play the takli and spin. Testing time seems to be coming faster than I had expected. We must accustom ourselves to standing unmoved in the face of cavalry or baton charges or bullets. Gandhi sounded a warning to the black regime. If the government neither arrest nor declare the salt free, they will find people marching to be shot rather than be tortured. He explained the difference between freedom and license. Freedom is a fruit of suffering. License imposes suffering upon society, and labeled the government as a government of unbridled license. On the promulgation of the Ordinance of the Press Act, Gandhi advised the pressmen to be prepared for handing over their property along with their bodies to the authorities rather than sell their souls. In a mango grove at Karadi, a village near Dandi, Gandhi set up his camp. He sensed that the time had come for greater acts of rebellion. In a draft letter to the Viceroy, he announced his intention to raid the Dharasana salt depot. It would be cowardly on my part not to invite you to disclose to the full the leonine paws of authority and to give the victims an opportunity for greater and greater suffering. Success is the certain result of suffering of the extremist character, voluntarily undergone. Gandhi and his disciples had gone to sleep in the palm leaf hut at Karadi. At dead of night, on May 4th, a sudden tramping of feet was heard, disturbing the quiet repose of the camp. A party of armed constables entered Gandhi's shack to arrest him under Regulation 25 of 1827. His message to the nation was, India's self-respect is symbolized, as it were, in a handful of salt in the satyagrahi's hand. Let the fist holding it, therefore, be broken, but let there be no voluntary surrender of the salt. I would like our people to make the highest sacrifice of gaining life by losing it. The state prisoner was taken to his old quarters in the Yeravada Central Jail and was detained without trial under the most arbitrary law. Men, women, and children of all communities and classes in India joined together and proclaimed their determination to win liberty or to die. India waged a relentless struggle, facing hardship cheerfully on the path of high purpose and noble endeavor. It was in this readiness to suffer that the moral power of this movement resided. Massive raids on salt pans and depots were organized. True soldiers of India, without care of fame or reward, labored unceasingly and peacefully. Civil disobedience everywhere was answered with firing and barbarous lathi charges. Those struck down fell sprawling. Government measures became more and more intense and brutal. The non-violent satyagrahis showed marvellous endurance and discipline. Thousands courted imprisonment and suffered all manner of privations. Here was India being governed forcibly under an absolute dictatorship. The bureaucracy were for more and more ruthless measures. Every kind of civil liberty was suppressed. With various repressive ordinances following each other in quick succession, grew the opportunities of breaking them. Presses were seized and news bulletins appeared in cyclostyle to break the law of sedition. The boycott of foreign cloth and picketing of liquor shops was intensified. The peasantry were in fine mettle and the no-tax campaign was started. The events had given the people confidence in their national strength and stamina. India was in full revolt. Scores of members resigned from the legislature. The Congress committees were declared illegal. The police began mass arrests. The leadership of the campaign passed from one person to another in quick succession. India became a vast prison house, and yet the government failed to bend the people. Hundreds laid down their lives at the altar of freedom. It was a grueling battle, and it went on for months.